Good morning. Can I welcome everyone to this, the 14th meeting of the Justice Committee in 2013. Can I ask everyone to switch off mobile phones and other electronic devices completely as they interfere with the broadcasting system, even when switched to silent. Apologies have been received from David McCletchy, and John Lamont is attending as his substitute. Item 1, decision on taking business in private. I invite you to agree item 4 in private. I'm proposing this as it involves consideration of potential witnesses for a follow-up roundtable evidence session on prison healthcare, which is due to take place on the 20th of May. Are you agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 2, fatal road accidents. It's an evidence session following a report by researchers from the University of Dundee on access in Europe by a bereaved family to information gathered during an investigation into a fatal road collision. The Scottish Campaign Against Irresponsible Drivers wrote asking us to give consideration to this report, and so we have been in correspondence with them and the other witnesses regarding the recommendations in the report over the last few months. And we also thought it would be timious in that we are dealing with the Victims and Witnesses Bill, and there may be scope for placing something within the context of that bill. No promises, but there may be scope. So that's also a consideration for the committee. Can I welcome to the meeting Stuart Cross, Senior Lecturer, Dundee Law School, University of Dundee, Margaret Decker, Scottish Campaign Against Irresponsible Drivers. I think I first came across you in 1999, perhaps, in the Petitions Committee. Superintendent Ian Murray, Head of Road Policing, Police Scotland. Stephen McGowan, Deputy Director of Serious Casework, and David Green, Head of the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit at the Crown Office and Procurator of Fiscal Service. And I thank you very much for your attendance this morning. Can I invite questions from members in a moment? And what I'd say to the witnesses is, if you wish to answer a question, unless it's directly specific that, of course you would then be answering it, then just indicate to me and you can come in, and I'm hoping for some interaction between witnesses once a question is posed. Jenny.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. The University of Dundee SCID report recommends a statutory right for access for families after a fatal accident to the police reports and investigation reports. Can I put a question to both Margaret Decker and Stuart Cross? Why do you think this is necessary, and why do you think the current system isn't sufficient?
Who wants to start? Ms Decker.
Can I just say thanks to the committee for inviting us to be here today. Road casualties are indiscriminate, and as road users we're all at risk. A road death is not an ordinary death. It's sudden, premature and violent, and according to World Health Organization, it's all the more acute because the victims are overwhelmingly healthy prior to the crash. Families bereaved by road crashes need to know that they can access the information, documents if they so wish. Having access to the investigation documents empowers bereaved families to work through the finality of a death. And I can just say the Procurator Fiscal acts in the public interest, yet many victim families feel isolated from the process of law. They feel they're no longer part of the public. One bereaved mother recently said to me, they assume to do the thinking for you instead of asking you up front what the information they can get and how they can get it. Bereaved families have the right to know what information is gathered in the course of an investigation into their loved one's death so that they can access the information if they so wish. The information they seek is not about state secrets, drug bans or the like. They're only asking for the investigation documents into their loved one's death. There must be a transparency here so that the bereaved families can work through the grieving process.
Margaret, I think, will come back in due course and elaborate further as to why she sees some issues with the current system. I just want to offer 2 comments as to the possibility of inclusion of a right in the legislation. Firstly, I think it would give preeminence to the status of families of road accident victims as victims, and clearly identify those families and survivors as victims. And secondly, I think it provides the opportunity to actually change the balance in terms of discretion. At present, there is discretion which lies at the hand of other parties as to the disclosure of some of the information that Margaret's referred to, and I think there's a coherent argument that actually the discretion should lie with the victims as those who have most interest in accessing that information.
Does the panel wish to comment at this stage?
Say something about discretion, and the discretion to give information at Crown Office. We do our best to give access to the information to nearest relatives where we can. The discretion that we exercise and what our guidance is clear on is that we should give that information to nearest relatives. And the only reason that we would really become involved in not giving that material to them is to preserve a fair trial. So the discretion is exercised in that sense rather than in keeping the information from them.
I think it's worthy of note, however, that those documents and all that information would be given to the family at the conclusion of the criminal proceedings when there was no longer an issue about preserving the criminal case. So we do have a presumption that all documents will be handed over on request.
Mrs Decker, you want to come back in?
Oh, well, the family may be aware of the situation that the family of John Lakin find themselves in. Some of the committee members may be familiar with the case. And the criminal proceedings finished in October 2012, and the family are still seeking the documents.
I don't know if any of the can comment on that specific case at this moment, but we can certainly have a reply at some point. You can you?
I wouldn't like to comment on the specific case, but if there's an issue with the specific case, then I'll take that away at the end of the committee and we'll do what we can to resolve the particular issue in that case.
I also say the mother of Craig Newton, a cyclist, she was reported just last month as saying that 2 years have passed and all she knows is that her son was killed by a bin lorry and she needs answers.
So what I suggest, we've got those two cases on the record. If you would provide to the committee as well as to for the other witnesses, others who are still waiting for information who've requested it, that would be very helpful, Mrs Decker. I'm going to let you back in as well, just to get the facts.
The family of 17-year-old Krista Durant, who was killed in 2012, asked through Freedom of Information, they asked for the investigation documents. They thought they would be free, but they were told by Northern Constabulary that ACPROS charges for this information. The cost would be substantial. The family are now making an official complaint. They were charged £500 for the police report.
I think these are on the record, and if we have more, do let the committee know about them. If you could list them, and I'll certainly, I know you'll be investigating to see what the position is, and the committee will look at that as well. So there appear to be issues. I'll just say appear to be at the moment. Jenny?
Ms Decker, you raised those 3 cases. I know the convener is suggesting that the officials will get back to you on the specifics of those cases, but are you raising those 3 cases to highlight that actually what Mr McGowan says about the documents being available after the criminal proceedings have finished is not really in reality the case for a lot of families? They aren't getting ready access to those documents, or they're being told that they have to pay substantial amounts of money for them.
You understand the difficult position the fiscals are in when they're dealing with families. But the thing is, the Crown Office Book of Regulations states that it's likely, it may, or should the families request copies. You know, it's full of these sort of airy-fairy words kind of thing. You know, so why we commissioned the Dundee Law School report was to hopefully get best practice identified whereby victim families could access the information they want in a timely manner.
Mr Green, do you wish to comment? Because you made a sort of largely sweeping, partly sweeping statement that you get everything at the end of criminal proceedings.
If I can perhaps come in, we will give the information at the end of the criminal proceedings. I wonder here if we have a job in explaining what our process is now compared to what it was a few years ago. Some of these cases are older. And also whether or not we need to be a bit more proactive in giving information in relation to the information that we will.
2012, I think you said 2012, that's not old.
2012 and 2013, yeah.
In terms of our evolving process, that some of those cases are older. Can I say that the guidance which has been referred to is guidance which is guidance to SFIU, which is David's unit. So all road traffic fatalities will come in and be dealt with by David's unit. So that's guidance which is now applied consistently by David's unit. The guidance perhaps a few years ago, and I take it the point that these are 2012 cases. from 1st of April 2012, all new cases which came into SFIU in terms of fatalities are dealt with that team, and they will meet nearest relatives and explain what information is available. Now, it seems that we may have a job to beef up that guidance in terms of what our own staff do in telling them what's available. The other thing which we are aware needs to be improved is the guidance which we put out publicly on the internet. Our old website was 10 years old and the information which we could put on it was limited. We've got a new website now, and one of the principles that we've got in relation to that website is that rather than us identify what we want to tell people, we're asking people what they want us to tell them. So in relation to groups who are victims groups and groups who have an interest, we're going to go to them, including SCID and other groups, to say what information should we be publicising more widely so that people can find that information more easily.
Yes, Mrs. Secretary.
You know, it would be better to proactively tell families, you know, when they have a meeting with a fiscal, what information is gathered in the course of an investigation and when they can access that information, rather than leave it to websites and, you know, which lots of families in their grief have no idea how to go about.
I think in terms of the Victims and Witnesses Bill, there's a part about witnesses and victims being actively involved in the investigation. There's a section in there. So I think what I'd just say to Mrs. Decker and to Mr. Cross generally is to look at the bill and see if there's other ways it could be tightened up. That's why I bring in that bill. I'm not just saying you just need to talk about that, but in that terms of that bill, there is more in there that can be done to help.
I believe in section 3 of the bill, you know, also Victim Support Scotland are asking that information be given proactively to families. Yes. Yeah.
So there is some scope for even increasing things in that bill if you wish to look at it. Anyone? I'll just take Graham next and then, yes.
I've got other questions, but just in the context of this particular discussion, and it's for Mr. Cross. In part of his report, he indicates a view that there's some conflict of interest arises from time to time where the enforcement and reporting agencies are involved. Can you explain where you see this conflict of interest?
I can give you a little bit of background to it in some of the literature, which hopefully will give some guidance here. The reference in the report to the potential for a conflict of interest is not indicating that definitively will be the case. So, but by no stretch of the imagination are we asserting that will always be the case. However, what we did identify was some reports from Europe, particularly the European Transport Safety Council, who commented on the applicability of differing roles. And they had, I have a particular quote here, and they simply said it was best practice again to avoid any potential for conflict, where they said that a key issue in any accident investigation is the status and impartiality of the body carrying out the inquiry. Any organisation with an actual or perceived vested interest is rarely able to act with total impartiality. The European Union must insist that organisations undertaking accident investigations are totally independent, as is stated in Council Directive 9456 EC. I think the issue is focus, which is where we have particularly the Crown Office and Fiscal Service, who have an absolute priority in terms of culpability and blame. Is there any potential criminal liability here? And then there's the secondary issue, which is the focus on road safety and investigation. And all we're indicating here, and there is a supplementary point I can make here about the effectiveness of independent bodies, which is that where you separate the focus, you remove any potential suggestion of conflict. And secondly, you focus one body looking on the culpability issues and another body looking at the road safety issues.
And as part of your reporting process, did you have a look at the situation in Scotland and did you identify evidence of conflict that made it important you should include it in your report?
No, we didn't. And I think that's probably something we should touch on in methodology here, which is that we were approached by SCID expressly to identify best practice in other jurisdictions, SCID themselves already having previously commissioned research which looked at existing processes It was a limited budget, short time scale, and it was very narrowly focused.
Could we get a response from Fiscal Service and Police if they feel able?
Well, that's what I'm waiting for them to nominate themselves, because we're being told that you have a conflict, you may have a conflict of interest that wasn't investigated in Scotland. Is that the case?
I must be honest, I can't agree with that. I think ultimately, as I said, road policing, my primary function is, is casualty reduction and road safety. So therefore, when we look at any, impact or any collision that occurs, that's my primary focus. Over the weekend there, we've had a number in Scotland, and this morning is sitting down and going through each of those. Now we look at that from all aspects. From the standard police approach is always victim offender location as we come to any scenario, be that crime or occurrence in the road network. So we're always looking to find out, first of all, as we come to a location, why did this occur here? So the road safety implications around the nature of the road, any presiding factors at that time. Looking at the nature of those who were involved from the point of view of those who become the victims or those who have been involved, if there has been that element of culpability, to identify all of that. We do that already in conjunction with others. We don't profess to be experts in everything. We do bring involved, right from the early stages, the local authorities who maintain the road network or the trunk road operating companies will involve the vehicle inspectorate if there's technical aspects about vehicles, if it's around driving within the course of employment, when we look at the HSE. And we engage early doors with that to try and find out all the aspects. So we're not coming at that from the point of view of a particular perspective. We're looking to gather all the evidence to make sure we understand exactly what occurred and where possible why it occurred, and then to try, if possible, with partners to either engineer that out or to look at any other options that might be available to us. And obviously we do that in conjunction with Crown Office from the earliest point of the fatal collision notification is given, and we seek direction at that point, again from that further independent aspect of direction from somebody totally removed from the actual scene in the incident to give us some further advice.
I wouldn't accept that there's any conflict of interest either, and I don't accept that our primary focus is on blame and criminality and any secondary focus is later on other issues. What would in practice happen is if there is criminal proceedings, then those criminal proceedings would have to happen first. And again, that's to do with fairness of trial. The same evidence which might come out at a fatal accident inquiry or thereafter in any other forum would be this, in relation to road safety, is likely to be the same evidence which would come out during a trial. So that the necessity is that a trial goes first. But I wouldn't accept that as the primary function as opposed and a secondary function. I think that's the wrong characterisation of it.
We have in recent times had fatal accident inquiries in relation to large numbers of issues that have caused or been part of the cause of road traffic accidents, not necessarily criminal issues relating to things like road layout, bridge parapet construction, vehicle construction and use, the servicing of vehicle, hydraulic oil spills. So it's not correct to say that our focus is solely or mostly on prosecution. That is the first issue we need to address, as my colleague has advised. But thereafter, we would be looking at all other issues, and if there was a proper and appropriate need for an FAI into any of these matters, we would apply to the court to have such an inquiry.
Yes, Mrs. Day.
An FEI is in a road traffic fatality is at the discretion of the Lord Advocate. An FEI is only mandatory if the driver or the cyclist or motorcyclist was killed in the course of their employment. The multidisciplinary road crash investigation body is not dissimilar to an FEI in the sense that it establishes the cause of death, the precautions and the defects in the system. The thing is, an FEI might last 4 or 5 days and costs a lot of money, whereas the multidisciplinary investigation body is there to reduce, to look at the findings, produce a report which is a public document, unlike an FEI determination. The disciplinary investigation body is a public document, and the recommendations in an FEI are not binding. And this was a fact that was highlighted in Lord Cullen's recommendations in his report of findings with review of fatal accident inquiries in 2009.
Somebody want to comment? I don't to start thinking with my lawyer's hat on here, so somebody who's much more fresh to the yes.
Of course, the fatal accident inquiry report findings aren't binding, but the fatal accident inquiry judgment and determination from the sheriff is a public determination. And I understand that Scottish Court Service and the Judiciary of Scotland are working out, and I think actually do at the moment, publish all of those on their websites. They certainly are available to all parties who are involved in the cases, but I think they're all now published as well. So it is a public document if a fatal accident inquiry is taking place.
Are you suggesting, Mrs Deck, there should be an FAI into every fatal road accident?
What I'm suggesting is, I mean, the multidisciplinary road collision investigation body was secondary to the research, and you know, this is something that came out, and we're not suggesting that there should be an FAI in every fatality or every fatality, but there is merit in a multidisciplinary road collision investigation body looking at all casualties, and this would also be helpful towards the government's road strategy for 2020.
Yes, Mr Manning.
I mean, I agree about the multidisciplinary approach, but I would argue that that's what we take just now, that's what we engage with, you know, because again, that's what this morning we'll be standing at the scenes of all these incidents over the weekend with the relevant road authorities to look at right from the off to say, like, what is the issues at this particular location, and we work back from that. So, but we do engage with other bodies and other agencies who have got an interest or who've got a locus to bear on the situation we're dealing with.
And without going into all the detail of the statistics, how dangerous are the roads in Scotland compared to roads elsewhere in Europe?
I must be honest, I'd be struggling to give you facts against the rest of Europe. We are, you know, thankfully seeing a steady decline in terms of, you know, the road deaths, you know, for a number of reasons, obviously, over the years. And we are certainly well on track just now for the 2015 and 2020 targets.
Just to follow on from the conflict point, the conflict point was not a principal driving reason for the recommendation that the multidisciplinary body should be created. And if in fact adherence to the European recommendations in the Council Directive is now being achieved through the mechanisms suggested by my colleagues, then that's to be applauded. Taking the point about road safety, one of the other strong reasons for recommending the independent body is that in other countries, and a particular country is Sweden, Sweden's been tracking progress towards 2020 road safety for a considerable number of years now, and we do refer to some of the evidence in the report. And as part of their annual reports on progress, they do refer to the contribution being made by an independent multidisciplinary body. So the Swedes are actually tracking not only compliance towards 2020, but the effectiveness of an independent body in contributing towards that.
I've got, is this a supplementary as well? Was that supplementary to?
Yes, just
all of these are supplementaries. Are these all supplementaries I have to this now? Yeah. Right, I've got Rod, then I've got Jenny, then I've got Alison, and then it was San for a moment, but you've transmuted into Sandra. So it's Rod, then Graham, no, sorry, it's Jenny, then Rod, then Alison on this, right?
Me?
No, Rod first, sorry, because he's been waiting, and then Jenny. Right, Rod.
Okay, morning. Mr Cross, I heard what you said about the European Transport Safety Council, and also I take account of what you said about the focus of your report not being on conflicts, but I think you referred, when you were talking about the European transport, to vested interests. What I would really like you to comment on is what vested interests are there in the system which, at the present time, if any?
I'm not sure I did use the phrase vested interests.
Well, you did use vested interests. I wrote it down.
If I did, then
yeah.
I shouldn't have said
it
so.
may have come from the European Transport Safety Council's kind of approach to it. But
well, in fact, that is the reference. It's not my language. Yeah. It is from the commentary from the European Union documentation, and it does refer to perceived vested interests. And I think that issue of perception is important. I'm not suggesting that there will inevitably be vested interests, but the language used in that particular phrase was perceived.
So you're not actually suggesting there is in the current setup?
We didn't investigate, and I therefore couldn't comment on that.
Okay, no, fine. I'll leave it there for
Jenny and then Alison, please.
Just to clear up the point about the multidisciplinary investigation units that the report proposes. I mean, Mrs Decker, you said that you would like to see these established, but then Ian Murray said that he believes that the current setup actually is a form of multidisciplinary investigation unit. So what are you proposing that's different from what currently happens?
Well, I'm really not proposing anything. I mean, this was secondary, you know, in the report. You know, and we just felt it was worthy of investigation further. You know, the Scottish Government are committed to a road safety strategy for 2020, and with the single police force now, we felt that it was an appropriate time, you know, where, you know, ideas should be rolled out and looked at further.
So what's in your idea about the multidisciplinary investigation that doesn't already happen? What improvement do you want to see there?
Well, the thing is, it's a public document, and you know, it's available to all. Names are redacted. It's a more in-depth document. I would suggest in an FAI, and hopefully the recommendations would be followed through, as Lord Cullen has trying to since 2009 in his report suggested. You know, recommendations in FAI are not followed through. I mean, they're written down, but very little is done to improve road safety when recommendations are made. So, you know, I think the multidisciplinary road collision investigation unit should be looked at, you know, and studied a bit further. I mean, that's really all I can say about it.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, so actually, I take what you say about you know, RTAs and fatalities and all the disciplines that are at them, unfortunately, that have to attend, including the fire services and so on. Is there any way that you're wanting publication? I take it, if there's not going to be an FAI, you're looking for some publication of what comes out of that.
Absolutely, yes.
Is there any way...
Every casualty, of which there was about 13,500 in Scotland in 2010. Yeah. Is
that something that could be done, or with redacted names, protecting people? I'm asking Mr. Murray now, you know, I just putting it to Mr. Murray, because I see what you're wanting when there's not an FAI, is people to know what happened, and for the point of view of improving road safety.
Yeah, I mean, the full product is obviously handed over, you know, into the investigation side of things with Crown Office, really. So that includes, you know, the actual report itself, statements, collision investigators' reports, photographs. So that is done. So anything that we learn from that and any aspect is all included in that documentation already.
What happens to these reports is that the Scottish Government, I think, produce each year a statistical return which draws out some of the themes of these road traffic deaths. So in relation to publishing each individual report, I think there might be issues in terms of some families, in terms of our experiences that not every family, many do, and we'll facilitate that where we can. Some families don't want to see the full circumstances of the loved one's deaths for understandable reasons. Whether publication of the full collision report is of use, I'm not sure. What might be of use is the themes, and those themes are published, as I understand it, in a bulletin produced by the Scottish Government, which draws out the generics of each accident and what lessons can be learned.
Yes, well, that's statistics. You know, we want to go a bit further than statistics. You know, if families want the information to aid the grieving process, you know, it should be given to them. Yeah.
You accept some families don't want to know.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, and families may want very brief information. Other families may want very detailed information. But the thing is, it should be their decision what information they get, and not taken, you know, by the other authorities.
Misunderstood. I thought you were talking, I see what that point you're making about individual events, but I thought you were talking generally about, you know, how we improve road safety as well through when there's not an FAI or not criminal proceedings or whatever, how one improves road safety as a consequence of other accidents that take place that are fatalities, which is what I think Mr. McGowan you were referring to with themes, you called them. I accept they're two different things.
Yeah.
You want to... Yes, just to come back on that. Obviously, like I said, when we investigate each and every, you know, sort of collision, we do that with. It's not just fatal collisions. Obviously, we're looking at. So, I mean, and that's the purpose. That when you look at things like the location of speed cameras, that's a rolling 3-year sort of analysis of data of every collision, and, you know, to identify what occurred where, to identify the suitability of action, and that's done in conjunction, as I said earlier, with local authorities and, you know, the trunk road operators, to make sure that, again, first of all, we can start from the location and then work back from there. So that actually occurs. So we are identifying the messages to make sure that the local authorities, you know, who obviously have got statutory responsibility for the provision of safe roads and road safety education, are aware of that, and obviously we tie that into our own campaigns. You know, for example, this month we're targeting, you know, motorcyclists will be the campaign that the Police Scotland are focusing on over this month. And again, that's an analysis of data in the past, and you know, and we'll be in the routes where it's occurring. So there's an analysis that goes on to make sure we're actually targeting our resources to stop these things happening.
Yes, Mrs Dick.
Can I just say, I mean, that's very exemplary and I applaud that. Anything to reduce, you know, road fatalities and road casualties is only to be applauded. But the thing is, when the worst case scenario occurs, and when a fatality occurs, it's these families we're looking at to access the information.
To get other members in to ask other questions, I've got Alison followed by Sandra, Graham, John Finney, then Colin. That's the roll call. Alison.
Thanks. There seems two strands. There's the need for families themselves to get the information, and we're clear of that. The other evidence we've taken on the Victims and Witnesses Bill emphasises how important it is for families to get some sort of closure by understanding everything that's gone behind. But you seem to go further than that in your discussion about the multidisciplinary group, where you were talking about a public document. Now, I can't imagine that it would always be in families' best interests for the wider public and indeed the press to know all of the details necessarily of every accident, and I would be interested to hear your views on that. I would have thought, put it to you, that perhaps what would be more useful is assurances that action has been taken, and therefore it would be useful for the discussions between local authorities or Transport Scotland and the police service to be made more public. Do you have comments on that?
Yeah, well, I think families would take comfort in the fact that, you know, some measures have been put in place to, you know, prevent a similar occurrence in the future. But the thing is, you know, how are these measures enforced? I mean, there's recommendations made, but it's up to local authorities and, you know, to implement these changes. And, you know, how can that be enforced? And that's, you know, that's a big road safety issue. Yeah.
Any other member wish to the panel? No? I move on to Sandra.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to look at the 4 recommendations in the round as has been forwarded by the report. I think you know, the one about the multidisciplinary road collision investigation body, I think we've discussed that to an extent, and I still am not sure whether you're still pushing for that, because even when you cite the example of the Swedish model, it says that they have an independent investigative body, but they also work with the police. So you know, they also work with the police, and of course we have you know, our own, which was set up in 2010. So if I could perhaps comment on that and maybe get you know, further information about the new unit that was set up in 2010 after Lord Cullen's information, obviously recommendation in 2009. I just want to know, where do we stand on this particular one? Margaret had mentioned the fact that perhaps you don't need this in a recommendation, it was just a comment to do with the bill. Are we still looking for this in recommendation 1, this new multidisciplinary? Or are we satisfied that the police...
Mrs Decker can comment on that. I think what I would comment on is that in terms of the recommendation, that was not, if you like, the strongest of the 4 recommendations. I think the one that was pivotal is the right to access information. And if you like, the multidisciplinary body was merely an extraction from European practice about the best way to ensure that that information was gathered and was available. So I think it is secondary in terms of the work that we did to the establishment of the right, which was a principal recommendation.
Thank you, Chair. I take your point on that. It's just that the language is very strong in the report, basically saying that to, you know, reiterate support for this multidisciplinary agency. I just want to get it right in my mind that we're not pushing this now. It's more to do with information.
The recommendation is still there. I think what's interesting today is to hear the suggestion from others giving evidence today that there's been movement towards that sort of process and behaviour. If the end result of what's happening in Scotland is to get close to that particular recommendation, then we end up in a virtuous position.
See, when I read the papers, obviously, and the evidence, I thought, well, there's 2 different camps here. I'll just use that. But you seem to be becoming closer together now as you've heard the evidence. And on the second point, which you said is the most important point, that families should get the information, I hear from others that this is provided if families wish it. It's just the fact that you know, to make sure there's a fair trial that's provided afterwards. Would you agree with that, or is there still more movement to go on that particular one? And maybe Margaret.
Comment particularly?
Well, the thing is, you know, Crown Office say, you know, families can get it if they wish it, but the thing is, lots of families don't even know what information is gathered in the course of an investigation, for lots of different reasons. You know, I think it's essential that families be told proactively at the beginning of an investigation what exactly, you know, the investigation documents will contain, and at a suitable point at the end of an investigation or at the end of criminal proceedings, they will be able to access these documents as a legal right if they so wish.
I'm glad you said it. I was going to ask a right to obtain on request, rather than a right to deliver, a right to be provided. So, yes.
If they so wish.
Yes, that's important, isn't it? Because some people will not. I take the points, the distinction between a right to have to provide by the Crown Office, or the difference being the right to obtain if requested. And that's what you're seeking.
Absolutely, that's crucial.
Yeah.
Could I just follow
Yes,
up on that? Just slightly
sorry.
follow up on that one. Thank you, Convener. You know, we've got that one right if they wish, and obviously I've heard from others to say that that is provided. This is one of the areas where it could fit into the Victim and Witnesses Bill. Could I perhaps hear from Mr McGowan or Mr Green or Mr Murray if this is, you did say that this was produced but you had lessons to learn, and it's something perhaps you would work on?
I'm sure from what Mrs Decker said there are lessons to learn. In any road fatality, the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit, David's unit, will meet with the nearest relatives of the deceased, and we'll have an initial meeting to explain what the Procurator Fiscal does, what the Crown's role is, what material may become available, and, if you like, the map, as it were, of the case and the investigation going forward and what information can be made available. Now, in terms of doing that and what other information we can give as well as that face-to-face meeting, that's something which I think we'll have to look at and learn from as a result of the cases which have been drawn to our attention this morning, and I'll undertake to go away and make sure that we give that information. So there are lessons, no doubt, to be learned from going through those individual cases.
Thank you. I'm fine just now. Could you make
That's fine, thank you. I'm going to Graham's very courteously allowing me to take John Finney and Colin first, because they've not been in yet, and then Graham. So there we are. It's John Finney, then Colin, then Graham, please.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Mr Pearson. It would seem to me, panel, that the campaign's objectives with regard to two of the recommendations seem to be happening in practice. And I'm certainly reassured what I hear from the Crown Office about, and Procurator Fiscal Service, about examining again the information. I have a couple of questions for Mr Murray, and it is about the purpose of investigation, because again the campaign want to follow through the investigation. I mean, you don't investigate just for the sake of it, it is for a purpose, and one of the purposes is the long-term road safety strategy. So am I right in saying that in the most instances it's driver behaviour that's the problem rather than road design, and that your campaigns are to address driver behaviour?
It's a case of focusing on, if you like, which bit of that jigsaw is ours, because we work in partnership with others who can bring, you know, ultimately, like I said, we will investigate all collisions, and not only serious, and, you know, there's numerous examples of identifying even new roads such as the M80 where there was an issue with standing water, where, you know, the local force, having attended, you know, prior to day one of the Police Scotland, having identified a number of issues, spoke to the trunk road operator, you know, and had a meeting and put together, and you know, actually an engineering solution has been put in place with that. So we work with the partners, and we drive, if you like, the agenda that we're identifying to make sure the partners are aware, because obviously we're the ones that are on the roads 24/7, so we identify things that perhaps the partner agencies aren't always aware of. But the bit, if you like, the national campaign side of things is, if you like, where it's the bit we can influence. So identify either victim groups in terms of those who are vulnerable road users to see how we can join with others in terms of supporting any ongoing education initiatives, and also then looking towards, as you rightly say, the driver behaviour to make sure that we can influence that, again, by high visibility patrols, by making sure we're the right place, the right time, and taking that appropriate action. So when we identify offences, that we're actually dealing with the motorist appropriately, be that whether it's a warning, be it a report to the fiscal, or whether it's some other direct measure that's used at that time. So if you like, that's the bit that's easily owned by us, and that's the bit we've got the most control over.
Can I confirm, and given I represent the Highlands and Islands, the A9 is a major consideration, as you know, for the level of fatalities, and a lot of the rural roads. It is the case that your recommendations on road designs, albeit it may take some time, manifest itself in road design layout changes, but there'll be...
Yes, they do.
Yeah. Can I move on to another aspect, please? And again, it's yourself, Mr Murray. And I wonder the basis in which family liaison officers are appointed, and with review, from the perspective of the Scottish Campaign for Responsible Driving, how important that initial contact is to maybe set the scene for the level of disclosure there's going to be in information, the time frame of it. Can you tell us when they're appointed? Is it simply with where there is a fatality?
Primarily it's with fatalities. Obviously with some serious or, if you like, some more critical incidents, that may also be the case, depending on the nature of what has occurred in the collision. But it's one of the first considerations for the senior investigating officer in terms of that identifying, for the point of view, first of all, identifying the victim, but also to make sure that we then engage with the family at the earliest possible opportunity. There can be sort of confusion as to what you refer to as a sort of family liaison officer or a contact officer or whatever, and different forces use different sort of naming conventions over the years. But there's a clear, we all work from the Road Death Investigation Manual, and there's a clear chapter on that, if you like, the family liaison strategy. So in the point of view of the review that now occurs every morning, from my own chief inspector in terms of ongoing incidents, that's one of the first considerations in terms of, right, where are we with this? Where is the strategy in respect of each of these things? And one of the first for us is the family liaison side of things. From all aspects of it, from the point of view of, again, as Mrs Decker rightly says, the family are victims in this, and to make sure that we're actually delivering a service, right from the off in terms of keeping updated as to where we are and what we're doing. But there's also the need for us to try and obtain information from the family, and obviously that can be a delicate balance for those individuals who are involved. So we now have in place a different structure around how we do these things, and that will become more standard, so that, again, there's been confusion in the years, no doubt, because different forces referred to the same principles from the same manual in different ways, but the principles of the role were the same. That will now disappear in terms of a clarity as to that's what we're doing, and now a single standard operating procedure exists, for example, that will make that clearer.
And albeit there were different terminologies employed, was the practice the same, or was it the case historically that practices would be different and they will now be standardised?
The practice, again, I couldn't honestly say 100% of the time they should all have been the same. The training has been the same, it's been delivered in the same place at the same time at the Scottish Police College, and therefore those who are in fulfilling the SIO role, the senior investigating officer role, should have been engaging the same strategies at the same time in the same way. But I would like to reassure you that is the case now.
Thank you. And a question, if I may, to the Crown Office. I don't know if they're in a position to answer this. It's my understanding that the issue referred to by Mrs Decker regarding the charging of a fee by the former Northern Constabulary has been resolved, and the fee indeed has been waived. Can you confirm if you...
I understand that it has been resolved by the old Northern Constabulary. In any event, what I would say, and this is where we have to look at the information which is given, is that had the family come to us, we would have provided the documents for free. We wouldn't have, there'd been no charge, and that would have been part of the service we would have provided. So that's something that we need to look at, as how it was the family felt the requirement to go to the police for those documents.
Mrs Decker, you wish to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I'm just pleased to hear that Crown Office has recognised, that the information should be proactively given to families at the start, so that families don't have to go through an FOI or through the police to get the information they seek.
Did all the people, perhaps you can tell me from the 8, I think, FOI requests, were these all because people had to use FOI, or did they use FOI some as a first resort? I don't know, I'm just asking.
I think it's because they don't know where to go for the information. I mean, families at this most vulnerable time of their life don't even remember their names. Yeah. So it's very difficult for families to absorb information. So that's why it's so important that they be proactively told what information they can have, and given in a written form as well, so that they can take it away and read it at a later date. Yeah.
I was just clarifying, it may not be because they were refused the information, it's just they thought that was the way to do it.
Well, if they don't know what the information is gathered in the course, they don't know what to ask for.
Yes. That's kind of cleared that bit up. Colin, you've been very patient as usual, followed by Graham, who's never as patient as you. Colin?
Thank you and good morning. I think it's interesting, actually, just your own question there, because it would be interesting to find out if the procedures that had been that's already been described by Mr Murray, amongst others, about the things that happen just after a fatality is taking place, if it happened in the instances that you've actually offered to the committee. My actual question is based around what information should be given. Some reports can be incredibly raw, and not to put it too mildly, I don't think anyone who's actually seen one of these reports might really want it out in into the ether, if you like. Are you actually saying that you're looking for the original documentation with warts and all, which can be absolutely dramatic, and perhaps to the point where it, depending on the strength of the family, the situation, and various other things, that this information should be offered to them if so required, or are you looking for an edited version?
I think it's up to the family to choose. I mean, it's their loss. I think it's up to them to choose what information and what depth they require.
I wonder if it...
Yeah, sure.
I wonder if it might be helpful if I explain what happens when we start to investigate a road traffic fatality, or any other fatality for that matter, but particularly dealing with road traffic fatalities. We would gather the information based on the police report and the collision investigators report, any other information that the police are supplying to us. We would ask them to make further inquiry if we thought there were particular areas that needed to be looked into. Once we've gathered all of those papers, all that information, it's our practice to then ask the nearest relatives to come in for an interview, a discussion about what has happened. At that interview, they should be shown some of the material, if it's capable of being shown at that stage. It should be explained to them what we have and what we propose to do. Now, following that, we would then report to Crown Office, detailing whether we felt that a prosecution was appropriate, or whether we felt that no prosecution was appropriate and there might be an FAI, or alternatively the case might simply be closed. So the family should be told about these things at that stage. It is absolutely right to say that some of the material can be incredibly distressing and is very, very sensitive. But our guidance makes it perfectly clear that if it's requested and if the families wish it, then they will get it unedited. We do have certain processes in place to try to minimise the difficulties that might result from that. In particular, we will send post-mortem reports and occasionally books of photographs, if they're particularly distressing, out to general practitioners with whom we have an arrangement, and then the general practitioner is able to explain the technical medical aspects of this to the next of kin if that's required, and also to provide any other support that the nearest relatives might wish. So there are processes in place to explain it. We would explain to them that some of the material can be very distressing and very, very difficult for them. We would try to explain all of that in a way that's sensitive, so that they understand if they request to see it, they may see things that will be very, very hard for them. But we take the view, and it's quite clear in our guidance, that if nearest relatives wish it, then they get it.
Mrs Decker.
Can I just say, a family recently requested the post-mortem report, which I believe is available, at any time during the investigation, and they were told that it's distressing and anyway it's evidence. So we told the family to request the post-mortem report to be sent to the family doctor. It's really not up to families to be proactive in this respect. As I can only reiterate the fact that families are going through a traumatic time in their life. They've got to be proactively told what information they can get, and it's not at the discretion of fiscals.
Well, again, I would reiterate that our guidance makes it clear that they should be proactively told about it, and that they are made aware of what we have and what they may ask for and what they will be given should they ask. It has to be said that a great number of nearest relatives do not wish to see it. They're happy to have the meeting and the discussion and to have these matters explained to them, but they don't wish to see photographs or the collision investigators report or the post-mortem report, because they are very, very distressing.
I think rather than, obviously, don't wish you to name anybody, I think it would be useful if that party were to contact at Mr Green's office if there has been some kind of difference. Yes.
I was just going to say that Margaret has contact numbers and email for me. I do have an additional, more direct telephone number which I will give her later today, and I would like to make it clear that on any occasion, if there is an issue like this, I'm more than happy to hear directly from her.
I'm very, welcome that. But the thing is, it's not up for voluntary bodies like us to be chasing up. I mean, the guidelines, and should be there, and they should be proactively given, and there should be a legal right for families to get the investigation documents if they so wish.
I appreciate that, but simply in this particular case, that if there's been some flaw in the process, that Mr Green's made aware of it, and it's a discrete matter for the parties that you know about and Mr Green may know about in that particular thing. But we are talking about the generalities as well. But in that particular case, I think it's on Mr Green's office. Colin, sorry.
I would have serious difficulties with raw data being sent to the people themselves. I think the idea of sending to a general practitioner is a lot more sensible, I would suggest, in this instance. But I would take you to what you actually said, Mrs. Decker, before about the information that has been already given to the close family of the deceased, which is, you say, they're not, perhaps not, they're not in a position where they can think straight. Their process is a bit confused, shall we say, and they don't remember. Do you really, I mean, would you not agree with me in the sense that for someone in that mental place, if you like, that handing over that type of documentation may do an awful lot more harm than good, because they simply don't understand what they're really asking for?
I mean, you're presuming that that they're looking for this information immediately after the death, but some cases take 3 years to get to court. And during that time, families, don't have the details that they're looking for. So after that period of time, they would be looking for the investigation documents. When a family, at what period in their grieving process they might want these documents, I can't say. But we're not suggesting that they be given immediately. But they should be told proactively what information they can get. And they can access that information when they so wish, if they wish.
Moving on to Graham.
Thanks, Convener. 2 points I wanted to cover. The first one, I think, fairly brief. The second one, hopefully a bit more depth. First one is about this right to access, if requested. I think the key point that we visited here is the right to know that you have a right of access is one of the important points. So the first question is it part of the process? I know Mr Green, I know that he would be very engaging with victims and explaining full things, but is there a system whereby victims and families are given a sheet which outlines the documents that can be included within their particular case and some summary of when access might be arranged if they so wish? And it means they've got a document in their file that they can go back to and read when they've got time and they've got the patience and they've got the ability to do so. And secondly, given that we've now got a single police force and a Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service, for the future, if an FOI request comes in such circumstances, is it feasible a flagging system could be engaged that would warn both authorities there's something going wrong here? Because it seems ridiculous that a family have been told that they need to pay £500 to get information in these circumstances.
In relation to the FOI, I think we can do that. In relation to what material families get, they do get material. It doesn't say quite as specifically as you've outlined what the rights are. I think it could. I think that's something that we can take away from today and provide so that we're much more specific, and that would add a degree of transparency to the process.
Would that help from your viewpoint, that there would be a clear document at a fairly early stage that would explain to families what they've got a right to ask for if they wish?
Yes, I mean, there is the break of, in conjunction with the Scottish Government, have produced a pack I mean, a pack. I mean, how can families read a pack? You know, it's...
Brief document that told them.
Yeah, but the thing is, in the pack, you know, there's lots of things stated there that should happen but don't happen, you know, so it's very important that families, as you say, have the right to know what information they can gather. Yeah.
The more substantial point from my own viewpoint is that I think an area where there can be conflict, and that is where a police officer is involved in a road traffic accident. Thankfully, very few end up as fatalities, but there are many accidents over a year where injuries occur, and on some occasions, unfortunately, fatalities. And I know of one that's been raised with me where there's a real sort of angst amongst the family and relatives about how it was handled. Are there ways in which there can be an improvement in the way these accidents are handled? And is there a way of engaging some form of impartiality to remove any fear that there was a conflict of interest in such circumstance?
Those cases would now be investigated by PIRC, the Police Independent Review Commissioner. So, whereas in the past a fatal accident involving a police officer, what would happen is an external force would come and carry out the investigation, and it would be police officers who were investigating, police officers albeit from another force on behalf of the Procurator Fiscal. From the 1st of April and the passing of the new legislation, or the coming into force of the new legislation rather, the Police Independent Review Commissioner would take over the investigation of that incident where there's been a fatal accident or where there's been a serious injury, and that investigation into whether it was a crime or whether it was not a crime would be carried out on behalf of the Procurator Fiscal by the Commissioner. So you have the independent Commissioner and you have the independence of the Lord Advocate and the Procurator Fiscal guiding that investigation as a whole. So it's a different landscape now from the landscape that there was before the 1st of April.
Point in the process would the PIRC become involved in that investigation? Road accident happens on a Saturday evening, 11:30. When does PIRC turn up?
PIRC would become involved almost, if it was a fatal accident, almost straight away, or a serious accident. What should happen is that the on-call road traffic senior investigating officer immediately makes contact with the Procurator Fiscal from SFIU, who's on call, and the on-call PIRC duty investigator, and there'd be a discussion then, and at that point, arrangements would be made for PIRC to come in and carry out the investigation.
You want to say any more to that?
No, I think just to reiterate that point, that it's a 24/7 service through PIRC, and those individuals investigating have got the power to direct resource, and you know they're given the full powers of a constable in terms of dealing with the investigation. So at that point, I feel like we are assisting a body as directed, as opposed to leading that investigation.
From your point of view, is that an improvement on what happened before? Does that? I mean, the indication from Mr McGowan is a changed landscape, presumably from his viewpoint, for the better. From your aspect?
I mean, I must be honest, I was content with what previously occurred, but so this gives me no cause for concern. I'm content that ultimately we will have perhaps even a quicker response, which obviously, you know, from the infrastructure of Scotland, etc., there's significant concerns about, you know, sometimes there's an undue delay to deal with the scene. So the perspective of having availability of resource to come and do that, it certainly causes me no concern.
I have to say this to you, and it gives me no comfort to say this to you. Although you're not concerned, you indicate that you weren't concerned with the previous setup, you'll know that many families were.
Yes,
and
I am aware.
And in itself, you've got a duty to try and deal with that concern.
Yes.
Those cases that lie unresolved, is there any way in which the authorities are able to, in some way, resolve some of the perceptions and feelings that families have that these matters haven't been properly investigated?
These relate to the
historic.
Yeah, when we say historic, they might be within the last few years.
Incidents before the 1st of April.
Ago.
Incidents before the 1st of April,
yes,
when the legislation came into force. There's no formal process of looking at them, if that's the question. There is no formal process. What there is there's the ability for any case, as with any potential crime, to be reviewed if it remains unresolved. So if there were representations, any evidence could be looked at and it could be looked at again, but there's no formal process in place. Each case would have to be looked at individually. There's no formal process, though, if that was the question.
Referring to the letter from the Crown Office, is that there will be no further proceedings unless other evidence comes to light.
Other evidence comes to light.
Which always is the standard letter.
Indeed.
Yeah. John, this is supplementary to this because we've got John Lamont waiting.
Convener, yes, I'm sure Mr Pearson isn't wanting a different category of treatment for a driver of a vehicle just because they happen to be a police officer. There's no suggestion of any retrospective application on the part of PERC for previous accidents, is there? Mr McGill?
I'm not saying that I'm going to direct PERC or the Lord Advocate's going to direct PERC to carry any of these investigations. No, absolutely not. What I'm saying is, as the convener clarified helpfully for me, is that if there is fresh evidence in relation to any case, whether that's about a defect in the original investigation or fresh evidence in relation to the incident itself, that can be looked at. Now, the appropriate organisation to look at that information would depend upon the information. Whether or not, you know, it would depend whether that be a matter for the police, whether that be a matter for the Review Commissioner or whoever. So it would be a case-by-case look at these cases.
Thank you, Convener. The discussion this morning has rightly focused on the information provided to the victims or the families of victims of fatal road collisions. And I just wondered whether you think the provision of information or the extension of this should be to the victims, or the families of victims of non-fatal road collisions as well, or whether that's just been presumed, or do you see a distinction?
In practice, there is a distinction in terms of the level of engagement we have in practice. In principle, after criminal proceedings are completed, I don't see any difference in principle that information could be given to the victim of that crime. And in principle, in terms of our guidance, although we have specific guidance on fatalities and how we deal with fatalities, our more general guidance would apply at that point, and interested parties, who would include obviously the victim, would be able to access information such as a collision investigator's report if that was requested.
Can I just say that serious injury is only included in dangerous driving offences. Serious injury, loss of limb, brain damage is not included in careless driving offences, you know, which is a reserved matter, but is one that we are campaigning on.
I don't think that's specifically right as a matter of law, that the consequence of the driving doesn't determine the nature of the offence. So it's the nature of the driving which causes an offence to be classified under a particular dangerous driving or without.
Matter. I think that's often difficult for people to understand, that you may be driving without due care and attention and you just hit a lamppost. You may be driving without due care and attention, you hit a lamppost and a person who's standing at that lamppost and who is killed. But the nature of the offence is the same, but the consequences are so very different. I wanted to ask about the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit. The difference between life and death can sometimes just be the emergency ambulance service getting there quickly, and someone may have very, very serious and, you know, continuing through their life injuries. Is there a role for that being extended to serious, in the case of very serious accidents, and not just where there's been a fatality? And someone may be in life support for years, and all kinds of things may happen. They're quadriplegic following on something, you know, it's just a matter of the medical attention they got at the time they didn't die. Is there a role there for it being extended to very serious accidents? I just wondered about that. I thought that's perhaps where John was going.
Fatalities Investigation Unit's expertise is in relation to the investigation of fatalities. So that
Says it in the name.
It says it does what it says in the name. In relation to other incidents where someone was very badly injured, those would be dealt with if there was criminality by other prosecutors within COPFS. So they would still be dealt with very thoroughly and still be dealt with very seriously, but they would be dealt with by a different group of prosecutors. One of the things that we intend...
say it's just the point of the medical attention at the scene that may just be 5 minutes away from being fatality and being something that continues through somebody's life. Why?
it's a question of where the specialism is drawn, and our specialism at the moment has been fatalities. Now, one of the things that we're going to do within the fatalities investigation unit is to set up a road fatalities team. And one of the things that we will do is to make sure that, whereas at the moment all of these cases are dealt with by senior and experienced prosecutors, we will also make sure those prosecutors are accredited prosecutors. And one of the things that we could look at is in relation to, and who've gone through a certain degree of additional training which deals with some of the specific issues in relation to what comes up at road traffic trials. There can be a slightly different dynamic and slightly different issues. One of the things that we could look at is in relation to whether or not in that type of incident where you may have a Section 2 or a Section 3 with very serious injuries, because some of the same issues may arise at trial, whether or not those accredited prosecutors would be the people who may do those trials and do the prosecution in those trials.
Would that be information that, Mrs Decker, you'd want where the families, where the party who'd been injured couldn't speak for themselves anymore, let's say, the victim of a road traffic accident, they've not been killed, but there's near as damn not being able to express themselves anymore. Would that be an issue where you may wish to know, you would want families and to have the right to have information?
Well, again, I mean, each case is different. It may be that serious injury cases are dealt through the civil courts, in which case, they could access information, through their solicitor. But certainly, I think it should be looked at. I mean, our focus in this report was in fatalities, but it may be something that families would welcome.
In injury, things like that, where a person's unable to do it, it seems to me it's a flicker between being a fatality and being in that condition. It might be a very narrow range of cases, but families might be in that position, perhaps in some respects worse position.
Well, I mean, I know from one particular family who was very seriously injured, and his reaction was that he would have preferred the doctors not to have saved him, given the quality of life he had. Yeah.
I just leave that as a thought. Does any other questions, John? No, any other? But I thank you all very much for your evidence. Thank you. It's an interesting point. Some of the brain injuries in Canada. Legislation. 3 negative instruments. The first is the Freedom of Information Scotland Act 2002, Scottish Public Authorities Amendment Order. 2013, SSI 2013-126. This instrument adds a number of organisations to Schedule 1 on the Freedom of Information Scotland Act 2002 to require them to comply with the Act. The Subordinate Legislation Committee is content with the instrument. Do members have any comments? Are members content to make no recommendation in relation to the instrument? The other 2 instruments are the Firemen's Pension Scheme Amendment Scotland Order 2013, SSI 2013-128, and the Firefighters Pension Scheme Scotland Amendment Order 2013, SSI 2013-129. These instruments apply increases to pension contribution rates of firefighters who are members of the pension scheme set out in each instrument. The difference in schemes relate to the time at which a firefighter joined the service. The Subordinate Legislation Committee has drawn the instruments to the Parliament's attention on the grounds that they were not laid within the required timescale of at least 28 days before they come into force. The SLC was content with the explanation given in the letter. However, this committee is required under standing orders to consider any letters to the presiding officer on the breach of laying requirements. This letter is on page 9 of your paper, paper 2. Do members have any comments in relation to these 2 instruments? Or on the letter to the presiding officer on the breach of laying requirements? You have no comments to make. Are you content to make no recommendations? We now move into private session. Thank you.